I didn't expect anything to happen that day. It was one of those ordinary afternoons, the kind where the world feels quiet, almost unremarkable. I had stopped by the little bookstore near the cafe I often went to. The sunlight fell softly through the tall windows, painting the wooden floor in warm streaks. The faint smell of paper and coffee blended together in that calming way only bookstores with cafes manage to pull off. I was scanning the shelves, my mind wandering from one book to the next, when I noticed her. She wasn't loud or overly noticeable. She didn't sweep into the room demanding attention. She simply existed there, effortlessly present. A woman in her early 40s with an elegance that wasn't flashy but unmistakable. Her posture was relaxed, yet confident, like she knew herself and didn't feel the need to prove it to anyone. She was looking at something across the store, but then our eyes met, and something shifted. There was no intentionality in the way she looked at me, or at least it didn't feel like what I would call flirting. It was warmer, quieter, and somehow deeper. The kind of look that makes you pause, makes the world feel a little slower, like someone is noticing not just your face but the edges of your thoughts you don't say aloud. For a moment, I froze, caught off guard by the sensation of being quietly seen. There was a calm intensity in her eyes, something familiar yet completely new. I looked away, embarrassed, pretending to browse the books, but I kept catching glimpses of her from the corner of my eye. Every now and then, our gazes would meet again, and every time, that same quiet recognition lingered. It wasn't a look of judgment, and it wasn't impatience. It was something else. Something like acknowledgement, like being noticed for exactly who I was, even in the smallest, most mundane of moments. I tried to shake it off, told myself I was overthinking it. But the truth is, I didn't want to. That feeling of being quietly wanted, even without a word exchanged, was almost intoxicating. I realized then how starved I'd been for that kind of attention. The kind that didn't demand anything from you, but simply existed, like a gentle invitation. I left the store that day with a strange mixture of curiosity and an unfamiliar flutter in my chest. I didn't even know her name, and yet, I couldn't stop thinking about the way she had looked at me. The memory followed me down the streets bathed in afternoon sun, lingering long after the encounter ended. I had felt it before she spoke, before any introduction, before any conversation. And somehow that was enough. For the first time in a long time, I felt wanted. And I didn't need her to say a single word to make it real. A few days later, I found myself back at the same bookstore. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe it was something else, but I couldn't stop thinking about her. The memory of her quiet gaze kept tugging at me, like a gentle pull I didn't quite understand. I told myself I was imagining it, that perhaps my mind was giving significance to a single glance, but the moment I walked in, my stomach gave a small, undeniable flutter. She was there again. Same corner, same gentle posture, scanning a shelf of novels with a focus that seemed so effortless. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should pretend not to notice or simply let myself observe from afar. But then our eyes met. This time she smiled first. Not a playful or teasing smile, just soft, unassuming, and sincere. And yet, it was enough to make my chest tighten, like I'd been holding my breath without realizing it. I wandered over to the section she was in, pretending to browse the books. My eyes kept drifting to her, and I caught the faintest glimmer of recognition in hers, as if she remembered our previous encounter. It wasn't awkward, but there was a quiet electricity in the air, subtle and grounding. At one point, we both reached for the same book at the exact same time. Our hands brushed, and I felt that soft, accidental spark, a gentle reminder that physical contact, even fleeting, carried weight. "Oh, sorry," she said softly, withdrawing her hand but keeping her eyes on mine. Her voice was calm, measured, warm. It wasn't flirtatious, but there was an easy comfort in it, like she knew I wouldn't overreact, like she trusted that moment wouldn't be awkward. I smiled back, feeling an unspoken acknowledgement pass between us. "No, it's fine," I replied, my voice just above a whisper. And in that simple exchange I felt seen again. We lingered there longer than necessary, neither of us moving on immediately. She picked up another book, flipping through the pages slowly, while I pretended to study a different section. But every so often, our eyes would meet, and a small smile or nod would pass between us. I noticed subtle details I hadn't before. The faint scent of her perfume, a soft swirl of hair around her shoulders, the way she stood with quiet poise yet didn't seem stiff. There was something oddly familiar about her presence, though I had no idea why. When she finally left the section, she walked past me, and our shoulders brushed lightly again. A warmth spread through me that I couldn't name, a comfort I hadn't felt in a long time. As she exited the store, I realized that the connection wasn't about words or intentions. It was about presence. Something about simply being near her felt natural, grounding, and strangely necessary. I left the bookstore with a soft smile, walking slower than usual, replaying every glance, every brush of hands, every fleeting smile. There was no confession, no conversation beyond a simple apology and acknowledgement. But that was enough. Somehow, just being around her, just existing in the same space, had created a quiet resonance between us. It was becoming clear. I didn't just notice her. I wanted to notice her, again and again, and she seemed to want the same. Even without saying anything, we were starting a conversation that neither of us had spoken aloud yet. Finally happened. That quiet, almost imperceptible shift from noticing her to actually speaking with her. I wasn't sure. Her voice was calm and warm, unhurried, like she had all the time in the world, but not in a way that drew attention. More like she was sharing a secret she wasn't even sure I'd notice. I shook my head. Not yet, but it looks good. My voice sounded steadier than I expected, and I realized I wanted this conversation to last longer than it probably should. We started talking about the book, then another. She listened more than she spoke, nodding thoughtfully, eyes soft and attentive. Every so often, her gaze lingered on me, subtle and unwavering, like she was seeing parts of me I hadn't shown anyone before. There was an unspoken understanding in her presence. She didn't need to impress me, and I didn't feel the need to perform. That rare ease made my chest loosen, my thoughts settle in ways they hadn't in years. At one point, we both laughed softly at a shared comment about the plot. As she did, her hand brushed against mine. Not deliberately, but in that accidental, fleeting way that leaves a warmth lingering on your skin. It was brief but electric. My fingers tingled long after we separated. I didn't move away. Instead, I felt drawn in, rooted by the simplicity of that contact. We wandered to the cafe corner of the store, each holding a cup of tea we hadn't planned to get, and the conversation shifted from books to life in general. She spoke with the kind of quiet honesty that makes you lean closer without realizing it. Every word was measured, thoughtful, and yet effortlessly open. I found myself sharing more than I intended, prompted not by words but by the comfort of her attentive presence. There was a moment when she tilted her head slightly, a strand of hair brushing her cheek, and our eyes met again. Time seemed to slow. No words were exchanged, none were needed. The way she looked at me made me feel grounded, understood, wanted. It wasn't flirtation. It was acknowledgement, recognition, a rare intimacy that neither of us had to define. As we left the cafe, our hands brushed once more. Lightly, naturally, lingering just a heartbeat longer than necessary. I caught her eyes and saw a flicker of the same awareness I felt coursing through me. Something was starting, something delicate and infinitely promising. For the first time, the quiet magnetism between us had a voice. And while the words were simple, the feeling behind them was profound. I realized that this first real conversation, this shared space, these small gestures, was where the slow, unspoken connection truly began. Even without grand declarations, I knew nothing would ever feel quite as ordinary again. After that first real conversation, I couldn't stop thinking about her. The bookstore, the gentle touch of her hand, her attentive smile. Everything replayed in my mind in soft, vivid loops. A few days later, we found ourselves walking through the quiet streets of the neighborhood. Just talking, just being. There was no agenda, no expectation. But somewhere along the way, everything shifted. We stopped at a small park, a tucked-away bench under a sprawling oak tree. the kind of place that feels almost private even in broad daylight. We sat down, careful not to crowd each other, though the space between us felt charged. I could feel it before I understood it, the pull of her presence, the unspoken current running between us. She leaned slightly forward, her elbows resting on her knees, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. That tiny gesture, so effortless, felt intimate in a way that startled me. I realized I was paying attention to every small movement, how her shoulders shifted, the curve of her smile, the warmth radiating from her as she laughed softly at something I had said. We fell into a comfortable silence. She didn't need to fill it with words. Neither did I. I could feel the subtle weight of her gaze, the way her eyes seemed to linger on me, quietly but intentionally. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't performance. It was acknowledgement, a profound recognition that I existed in that space and mattered. I had never felt it so clearly, so wholly, from another person. At one point, our knees brushed lightly. The contact was accidental, fleeting, yet it sent a ripple through me, a physical echo of the emotional tension simmering between us. I wanted to move closer, to see if she would lean in too, but I hesitated, afraid of breaking the fragile magic of the moment. That hesitation, that mutual uncertainty, made everything more potent. She shifted slightly and smiled at me, softly, as if she knew what I was thinking without a single word. My chest tightened, not with anxiety, but with anticipation, wonder, and a strange, exhilarating clarity. I realized, in that heartbeat, that the attraction was no longer something subtle or imagined. I felt it, in my chest, in my skin, in the small, unspoken interactions that had accumulated between us. We didn't speak for a long while, but our proximity said everything we couldn't yet voice. The silence was charged with a gentle, electric intimacy. Every glance, every accidental brush, every shared laugh carried meaning. I realized I didn't just want to talk to her. I wanted to exist near her, to be part of the quiet gravity that seemed to orbit around her. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light over the park, she looked at me with that same soft intensity that had caught me from the very first glance. And in that moment, I knew. I wasn't imagining it anymore. I didn't just feel drawn to her. I felt wanted, deeply and unmistakably, even though she hadn't said a single word to confirm it. It was a realization that took my breath away, leaving me both exhilarated and terrified, because I understood now that the connection between us had moved beyond curiosity. It had become something real, fragile, and undeniable, and I didn't want to let it go. The days that followed were restless in the best kind of way. I couldn't stop replaying that silent park moment, the brush of her knees, the lingering weight of her gaze, the quiet electricity between us. I found myself seeking her out, hoping for another encounter, another chance to exist near her, even without words. It was a late afternoon when we met again, this time at the little cafe tucked beside the bookstore. The air smelled faintly of roasted coffee beans and fresh pastries, a comforting warmth that seemed to mirror the soft tension building between us. She was already there, seated in a sunlit corner, her posture casual but her eyes catching mine the instant I walked in. That look, warm, steady, acknowledging, made my chest tighten before I even reached the table. "Hey," she said, her voice low and calm. Not playful, not teasing, just simple, sincere. The word carried more weight than I could have imagined. I sat across from her, both of us letting the quiet settle before speaking. For a long while, we didn't need to say much. The conversation started lightly. Books, music, small observations about the cafe, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. Then she leaned forward slightly, hands loosely wrapped around her coffee cup, and looked at me with that unflinching gaze that had already become so familiar. I like being around you," she said carefully, as if testing the waters. There was a pause, a small, hesitant inhale, as though she was waiting to see if speaking it aloud would change anything between us. Her eyes searched mine, not for approval but for honesty. I felt my chest tighten. "I like being around you too," I admitted, my voice steady but soft. "More than I expected." My fingers brushed the rim of my cup, but I didn't move away. Somehow, that small contact, the proximity of our hands, the warmth of her presence, felt safer than any words could. She shifted slightly, a subtle gesture of vulnerability that made my heart ache in the most tender way. "I know there's an age difference," she said softly, almost in a whisper, "and I'm aware of how that might seem unusual." Her words were careful, honest, not defensive, and I saw in them a flicker of self-consciousness she rarely revealed. "I don't care about that," I said quietly but firmly. "I care about you, about being here with you, right now." My voice carried the sincerity I couldn't quite put into her eyes, but I hoped she felt it in the space between us, in the small gestures, the leaning in, the subtle brush of hands across the table, the shared warmth of our presence. She let out a small, relieved sigh, and our hands met, lightly, naturally. It wasn't a romantic gesture in the dramatic sense. It was gentle, grounding, affirming. Our fingers touched, lingered, and for the first time, neither of us pulled away. That moment, small and unassuming, felt monumental. Words had finally given shape to what we had both been feeling, but the real connection, the pull, the recognition, the quiet desire, remained in the way we existed near each other. I realized then that honesty had a different kind of intimacy. One that didn't need grand declarations or dramatic gestures. It simply needed presence, acknowledgement, and the courage to admit what we already felt. And in that tiny, sunlit cafe corner, I knew we were standing on the edge of something delicate, profound, and entirely ours. It was one of those evenings where the world seemed suspended in golden light, the kind that stretches shadows long and softens the edges of everything. She had suggested a walk after our coffee, and I didn't hesitate. There was something magnetic about her presence that pulled me forward, even when I wasn't sure where we were going. We strolled down a quiet street lined with old brick buildings, the faint hum of distant traffic mixing with the soft rustle of leaves in the trees. Neither of us spoke much at first. Words felt unnecessary, almost intrusive. The conversation from the cafe lingered between us, like a delicate thread connecting our thoughts and hearts without needing sound. Then she stopped near a small fountain tucked into a corner of the street. Water trickled softly, catching the last of the sunlight. She leaned against the edge, folding her arms loosely, and looked at me with that same soft intensity that had haunted my thoughts for days. "I haven't felt this way in a long time," she admitted quietly, her voice almost swallowed by the gentle sounds of the fountain. I walked closer, feeling the pull in my chest that I could no longer ignore. "Neither have I," I said, my voice steady but low, careful not to rush the fragile moment between us. My hands brushed lightly against my pockets as if to ground myself, but I could feel my attention entirely on her. She took a step closer, just enough that our shoulders almost touched. The air between us was heavy with quiet anticipation, and I noticed the subtle way she shifted, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. I could see her pulse quicken slightly in the delicate curve of her neck, and I felt my own heartbeat echoing the rhythm. Without thinking, I reached out gently, placing a hand near her shoulder. Not a grab, not a claim, just a grounding presence. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in slightly, letting our proximity exist without words. My heart soared at the intimacy of it, the way mere closeness, unspoken, could convey more than any sentence. Then, almost instinctively, I brushed my fingers along her arm, a soft, lingering touch. She closed her eyes briefly and let out a quiet sigh, leaning just a little closer, as if that small gesture had been what she had been holding back, what she had wanted but hadn't admitted. The connection between us wasn't physical in a dramatic way. It was emotional, profound, a recognition of mutual desire tempered by patience and respect. For a long moment we simply stood there, shoulder to shoulder, connected by something neither of us could fully name. I finally lowered my head slightly and pressed a soft, careful kiss to her cheek. She didn't move. Her eyes fluttered closed, and a faint, content smile curved her lips. That simple contact, gentle, nonverbal, entirely consensual, felt like an affirmation of everything unspoken between us. As we resumed our walk, our hands brushed again, fingers occasionally touching, a silent dialogue of shared warmth and acknowledgement. The evening air wrapped around us, carrying a quiet promise. Something delicate had begun, something worth cherishing and exploring. And in that moment, I understood that our connection wasn't just desire. It was recognition, comfort, and the courage to finally let ourselves feel it fully. For the first time, I wasn't just wanted, I was understood, and the feeling was mutual. The days that followed our walk by the fountain were different. Charged, quiet, and entirely transformative. I found myself thinking about her in moments when nothing remarkable was happening. The hum of a morning train, the soft patter of rain against my window, the distant laughter of strangers. And yet, these ordinary moments felt extraordinary because they carried her presence in my mind, her warmth echoing in the smallest corners of my day. One late afternoon, she invited me for another walk, this time to a nearby park I hadn't visited before. The sun was lower now, casting long golden streaks over the pathways, the kind of light that softens edges and makes the world feel a little gentler. We walked side by side, a comfortable silence stretching between us, punctuated only by the occasional observation of a bird landing on a branch or the distant bark of a dog. Eventually, we found a secluded bench under a tall maple. She sat first, folding her hands in her lap, and I joined her, careful not to crowd her, but instinctively moving close enough that our knees brushed. The subtle warmth of proximity felt grounding, like the world outside this quiet bubble didn't exist. "I've been thinking about us," she said, her voice soft, tentative, yet carrying the same calm strength I had come to recognize. She looked at me, searching, vulnerable, yet confident in the honesty of her words. "I don't want to rush anything. I don't want to force what's already happening naturally." I nodded, feeling the same mixture of anticipation and ease. "Neither do I," I replied, letting my hand hover near hers before gently resting it against hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let her fingers intertwine with mine, light but deliberate, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond we had been building. For a while, we simply sat there, side by side, letting the silence speak for us. The world seemed to fade. The distant hum of traffic, the soft rustle of leaves, the golden glow of the late afternoon sun, all of it framing the small sacred space we had carved out for ourselves. She leaned slightly toward me, resting her head lightly on my shoulder. The weight was gentle but grounding, a soft confirmation of trust, comfort, and something deeper. "I felt it from the first moment," she whispered, almost shyly. "Even before I said anything, I felt connected, seen, wanted." Her words mirrored exactly what I had felt, quietly, in every glance, every accidental touch, every lingering smile. I smiled, my chest tightening with warmth. I felt it too, from the very first time our eyes met. I brushed a gentle hand through her hair, tucking a loose strand behind her ear. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the touch linger, letting the moment settle. We didn't need grand declarations or dramatic gestures. There were no promises about tomorrow, no pressure to define what this would become. We simply chose to exist in this moment, side by side, fully present and fully acknowledged. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, we stood together, hands still entwined, walking slowly toward home. The future remained uncertain, but in that shared warmth, we had found something far more enduring. A quiet, unspoken certainty that we were wanted, understood, and ready to explore what came next, together. And for the first time in a long time, I felt not just wanted, but entirely seen, entirely safe, and entirely alive.